8-2, which is impacting local zoning issues, and 8-30G, which is tend to be the all the issue right now. But can you share with us, Ken, the legal interpretation and the statutory coverages of those two statutes, and also evaluate some of the proposal, particularly a bill that's coming out of Planning and Development, House Bill 5132, and also the proposal by my colleague, Senator Anwar, in regards to desegregate Connecticut's proposal. So Ken, all yours. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. And we'll get to Representative Steinberg when he gets on.
Thank you very much for having me, Senator, and to all the representatives and senators on the call, thank you very much for joining us. This has always been an issue near and dear to my heart since I started at the legislature. It was an issue I covered for quite a amount of years, and I always like to say nobody really knows what 830G is until it shows up on their doorstep. And unfortunately, we've seen the repercussions of that, typically when it comes to, those local town zoning meetings where people show up and kind of realize, oh, this is, going to be put in my neighborhood, and maybe it doesn't, exactly, maybe it's not where it should be. In terms of 830G itself, that is the Affordable Housing Appeals Statute. It essentially builds in an automatic right of appeal for a developer who submits an application to a town under the statute 830G, where if the application is then denied by the local zoning authority, then the developer would have the ability to appeal that denial to the Superior Court here in Connecticut, where the burden would then actually flip, where most court cases, it's on the moving party, it's on the plaintiff, it's on the, it would be on the developer. In this case, it would actually be on the town to prove that it fits within some sort of health, safety, welfare denial issue. And we've seen through the court cases that, towns don't tend to do very well on these. I believe when I was at the legislature, we pulled about 20 cases and found that actually one town had succeeded in all their cases. And developers especially know this as well. They know the added costs that goes into this type of litigation. This isn't any type of litigation just any attorney can do. It takes a real specialty. So the attorneys who do 830G work, tend to be on the more expensive side. In terms of 8-2, 8-2 is the statute that essentially gives towns the ability to regulate zoning within their borders. Now, we've kind of seen, especially since 830G has become a bigger issue and has become more apparent to some people, we've seen some changes be attempted in 8-2, whether it be considering things we haven't considered in the past when passing zoning regulations, or adding on more things such as, eliminating the parking space requirements, things like that. So we've really kind of seen this, while there's still some interest in 830G, we've really seen a shift towards 8-2 and really trying to make changes to that in order to bring about more affordable housing. Now, you talk about some of those changes that have been proposed in there, specifically the issue of attorney's fees possibly being able to be awarded to a developer who moves for an appeal of a denial. Now you're talking about a situation where town isn't just responsible for their own legal bills, they're also now responsible for projecting out possibly how much the developer could spend on legal bills, because the town would now be responsible, if this were to pass, for that moving party's legal bills, despite the fact that Connecticut typically, has been a plaintiff-driven state, and plaintiffs are, responsible for paying their attorney's fees. We've also seen the number of committees that the statute could possibly apply to be expanded. We've seen that water pollution, flood control are possibly additions to decisions that could be appealed, and especially in a situation with either flood control or water pollution, while certainly somebody could make the argument there's a health, safety, welfare issue in that. Bringing in these two committees really kind of muddies the water and makes it appear like it's much more, it's much less a concern than it should be.
And can you elaborate a little bit on the proposal that is being proposed by Senator Anwar and Desegregate Connecticut from your legal perspective reviewing it?
Yes, and we've certainly seen some interesting proposals. I think the accessory apartments, especially at a time in Connecticut where we simply have an aging population. The old phrase kicking around when I was at the legislature was the silver tsunami was coming. And accessory apartments, while certainly, you have to make sure you have the available land and, that they're properly, built and everything. Though that is one very interesting piece. And we've seen more accessory apartments come along as we've seen housing going up, especially with our seniors, things like in-law apartments, things like that. We also talk about the, really in these bills, there's kind of an encouragement of high density housing. And while high density housing, is something that people wish to look at, I also think it's something that we kind of need to pump the brakes on and look at more. We've seen cases in other states, especially in New Jersey with the Avalon fire, where, this high density housing can really turn out to be a possible fire hazard because you have so many people living in that same area. Overall, in terms of what we're looking at in terms of legislation, one thing that we really tried to push was to make it more carrot and less stick, make it more achievable for towns to gain things like moratoriums, things like that. Under 830G, there's essentially two ways you can get out from underneath the appeals process. You've either on one end got to qualify for a moratorium, which there are point totals that go towards that, or you can attempt to get to your full 10%. Now, the other issue with those two categories is things are counted differently. So especially when you get into talking about a statute like 830G, anytime you're talking about even making changes to things like moratoriums or appealable decisions from a local board, you really have to dig into the weeds.
Well, thank you. And before we go to Betsy Guerra of COST, the Council of Small Towns, I want to welcome and invite Representative Jonathan Steinberg, who is back on. And if you'll unmute, please offer some words.
Can you hear me now?
We can see you too. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for hosting this, Senator. This is obviously one of the most controversial subjects we've had as a state and in virtually every municipality. Change is in the air. I am curious to see where all of this nets out. I think it is early yet. I'm going to participate in that Desegregate Connecticut call. I think they have next week, because I think that when we're talking about change in Connecticut, we need, to borrow a phrase you use quite often, Senator, we need everybody engaged. And right now, this is coming from one section, one point of view, and I think that we really need to be hearing from all different folks.
Well, I want to applaud you, Representative Steinberg. We have worked very closely on these issues, sharing and joining towns, and you have always been very active and engaged in this. So I want to thank you. And if our participants, I would love to also be on that call with Desegregate Connecticut and listen to the viewpoints. Agreed. I truly believe that we need to have all engaged shareholders offering viewpoints and get to solutions to move us forward, because I do believe that we all are aiming at the same goals, just different perspectives on how to get there. So thank you for joining us. And let me go right to Ms. Guerra, who is the Executive Director of the Council of Small Towns. throughout the whole state, and she can offer some viewpoints of her constituency's interest and thoughts on these proposed bills, 8-2, 830G, but also how their towns are approaching this in regards to land use and zoning. Welcome, Betsy.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you to the other legislators participating in this discussion and the other panelists. It certainly is a very important topic, and the Connecticut Council of Small Towns is taking a very thoughtful, very measured approach to examining these issues. We have issued an affordable housing survey to our members to obtain input on some of these proposals and how they may impact their towns. We're also holding working group meetings to discuss these in detail. And we're looking at it from a variety of standpoints. One, to what extent do these proposals truly address racial and economic disparities in this state? And I think everyone agrees that in order to truly address these racial and economic disparities, you need to take a more holistic approach. You need to look at other things like education, workforce development, job creation, home ownership opportunities, and things of that nature that allow people to develop wealth over time. At the same time, we are concerned that the proposals under consideration are really a one-size-fits-all effort to sidestep local zoning rules by dictating these as-of-right middle zoning, as-of-right accessory apartments, preempting local setback rules and other lot size rules in a way that's a big concern. Because while that may work in some of our urban and more densely populated areas, in areas where you don't have sewers, where you don't have public water supplies, it's a real problem. And so we're finding that a lot of our towns are very concerned about what this means in terms of their efforts to protect watershed areas, water resources, to protect against flooding, and develop stronger coastal resiliency efforts. And that's something that really can't be taken lightly. You know, our towns have spent an inordinate amount of time in developing their local plans of conservation and development. And they've also invested heavily, as well as this, and the state has as well, in preserving farmland, in protecting open space and watershed land. And so there are, as Representative Fernan alluded to, some competing goals here. And it's raising a lot of questions in terms of how we approach these issues. I think we also need to look at how we can build on the existing laws, existing efforts to promote affordable housing in our communities. There's a lot of good things happening, and I think people tend to say, oh, you know what, we need to move beyond that and adopt the new shiny proposals out there. But in fact, we are just releasing the Affordable Housing Toolkit, which is going to require towns by July 2022 to do a housing assessment to determine what the affordable housing needs in their community are, and then to develop affordable housing plans to meet those needs. And I think that's very important. I have had the opportunity to review a draft of the Affordable Housing Toolkit. It does talk about things like making sure that your town has an affordable housing committee to help you identify what those issues are, what those needs are. Is it something that you can work together to address? And I think to the extent that you can engage the community in these efforts, you move beyond those situations where you have a handful of people that are very vocal and very opposed to any kind of development, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's the grocery store, or whether it's a drive-through Dunkin' Donuts. You start to get them to understand what the needs of your community are and how this can actually help revitalize your community. So I don't think we should ignore those efforts. I think we need to build on those efforts. In addition, part of our survey asked our member towns, what are their success stories? Where have they made some inroads in addressing these needs? And a lot of them have pointed to the incentive overlay zones and how we can use those to promote affordable housing. And yet, have they been adequately funded? I've heard some rumors that no, they haven't been adequately funded. In addition, we have programs that are providing down payment assistance and low interest loans to promote home ownership, to give people that are challenged economically, the opportunity to develop wealth over time. Because think about it. I mean, how have our parents and grandparents really been able to pass on wealth to their children and grandchildren? It's through home ownership. And we need to do more of that to invest in our communities. But again, we can't ignore the fact that some situations, some areas are just not going to be able to support affordable housing to the extent that other people would like to see. And even, you know, I do have to question some of these proposals for middle housing, for the accessory apartments. I think they're interesting concepts, but I don't really understand how they're going to promote affordable housing, because you can have townhouses and duplexes and quadplexes that are extremely pricey and not going to move the dial at all on affordable housing. At the same time, we're also looking at proposals to see whether or not we do need to make changes to 830G, because has that really been successful in promoting affordable housing, in addressing the affordable housing needs, or has it just created a lot of tension in our communities? Because those tend to be for the high density proposals that people really are concerned about and really are concerned what the impact is going to be on their communities in terms of open space and watershed and farmland preservation. And the towns, if they cannot meet that 10% affordable housing threshold, they are subject to this 830G. Now, I've been in conversations with various developers, with the Department of Housing, and that 10% threshold doesn't make sense for a lot of communities. They're never going to hit it. I had one town tell me that if they took every single buildable lot in their town and put affordable housing on it, they would not come close to meeting that 10% threshold. And so there's this arbitrary threshold that is just kind of, again, creating tension, and I think really undermining opportunities to develop robust discussions in our communities about how we can address affordable housing needs. I live in the small town of Durham, and I was actually excited to see in my email box that there was an affordable housing survey. So they are starting to develop their assessment. They're starting to reach out to the community to find out what the needs are, what kinds of affordable housing people would support in their community. Because I think overall, we do recognize that we need to revitalize our small towns, that we need some development in order to make them vibrant, healthy communities. But at the same time, you just can't have these, again, one-size-fits-all mandates that disregard efforts to protect water resources, address coastal resiliency issues, etc. So again, we are taking a very thoughtful approach. There are some proposals I think we will be very supportive of. One of the issues that in the past we've opposed as an unfunded mandate has been relative to the training of local planning officials and who are volunteers. And there are concerns that if you require them to undergo a certain amount of training, that you're going to make it difficult to recruit volunteers. But at the same time, I think people realize, particularly in this Zoom world that we live in, that training is very accessible and that we can do more to make sure that the people that serve on our local planning, zoning, inland wetlands, zoning board of appeals, etc., do have the information and the tools that they need to really understand what it is that they need to do in order to promote affordable housing without encroaching on some of these other issues that are affecting their communities.
Thank you, Betsy. Can you share what your organization is all about and who you represent? I may not have done an adequate job in describing the breadth and the representation of your constituency.
Sure, thank you. Yes, the Connecticut Council of Small Towns was created in 1975, and we represent approximately 115 small towns throughout Connecticut. Most of our towns are very small in population, less than 5,000, but we do include towns of up to 35,000 at this point.
Okay, thank you very, very much. And to narrow down a little bit, I want to invite Francis Pickering, who is the executive director of the Council of Government WestCog, which represents from Danbury down to Westport, all the way down to Greenwich, encompassing Stamford and Norwalk. And Francis just recently had a meeting with all of their planning and zoning chairs to discuss the land use and zoning considerations, but also did a very comprehensive white paper analysis of Senator Anwar's proposal. So Francis, could you share in regards to your organization as well as your perspective on these areas of land use and zoning legislation that's currently in the legislature and statute, but also the forthcoming proposals as well. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Senator Hwang. I'm happy to do so. So you're absolutely right. I'm the executive director of the Western Connecticut Council of Governments. And for those who do not know, we represent about 610,000 residents, 16% of the state's population, 40% of the state's income tax revenue, and the central cities of Stamford, Norwalk, and Danbury. Our municipalities have been very interested in these developments surrounding planning and zoning at the state level. And they've come to the COG because this COG has a historic and statutory role in land use regulation. Under state law, we are charged with reviewing proposed changes to local planning and zoning regulations, subdivision ordinances, and local plans of conservation development, and creating our own regional plan. And the reason we do this is to ensure that municipalities do not impose costs on other municipalities, that they do not poach businesses, they do not build factories upstream that then wash pollutants downstream, and so on and so forth. In many ways, this role of the COG is extremely similar to the purpose of zoning, which is to ensure that a single land use does not create conflict for its neighbors. And one of the reasons that we've had larger lot zoning in much of Connecticut is because, as they said in the past, the solution to pollution is dilution. If you spread out a problem, if you can't see or hear your neighbors, they can't cause problems for you. In much of Connecticut, we have not done what neighboring states have done to, for instance, protect our urban water system. In New York State, there is a state regulation that imposes extremely stringent land use controls on vast swaths of the state, millions of acres, including the Catskills and the Adirondack Park. There's a similar setup in New Jersey with the Pine Barrens and the Highlands Commission. In Massachusetts, the city of Boston and suburbs condemned thousands of acres to build the Quabbin Reservoir. These were very controversial moves at the time and were extremely upsetting to people who live there. In Connecticut, we've taken perhaps a more of a Yankee approach, an approach that's effective but cheap. And that approach is essentially not to buy or condemn land, not to impose very stringent state regulation, but to leave it up to local municipalities to come to an understanding about how to protect our state. And when we look at the events of the last couple of years, we've seen how absolutely critical environmental resources are to our community's well-being. I don't have to go into what happened in Flint, Michigan. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that. Clean water is a social justice issue. In Connecticut, our cities have not preserved adequate land to guarantee clean water for their constituents. And if we do not protect that land, we will run into water quality problems, which are very expensive to treat. Instead, what we've done is we have basically pushed the cost of source protection out onto surrounding, less heavily developed municipalities through large lot zoning. Large lot zoning has also been pushed and required for public health reasons on site. 1 acre exclusive of wetlands is required to have a functioning septic system and well, given how often septic systems do fail. We've got a long history of that. Look at lake communities in Connecticut. Look at a $20 million project in Brookfield on 1/2 acre lots. Look at a $9 million project in Mansfield. It becomes very expensive, and municipalities that is government often have to pick up the tab. So to protect us from ourselves, to protect us from incurring larger costs in the future, we have turned to zoning. We've done this because under the United States Constitution, there's a takings clause. You can't deny somebody economic use of their land. In Europe, many of these properties would be restricted from development only for farming, silviculture, or open space. Instead, we've said we'll limit the intensity of the development to protect against future costs. So it's environmentally, public health-wise, and also fiscally sustainable. And that's what our communities recognize, even our urban communities. Last night, we had Danbury on the phone saying, we do not support what is in Anwar's bill. we intentionally have downzoned our land in the city of Danbury to protect our water. So getting back to what's before the General Assembly, Anwar's bill, I don't know exactly how coordinated it is with DeSegregateCT. It's all very freewheeling, but it's a response to a realization that 830G
We lost you, Francis. While Francis is getting back on the line, I do want to acknowledge and thank Sarah Bronin, who is one of the co-chairs of Desegregate Connecticut, in reaching out to me before the meeting, and am eager to continue further dialogue and collaboration to finding solutions. So I wanted to acknowledge her and her outreach to me before this. So while we're waiting for Francis, he was getting right to an interesting point, wasn't he? Are you back on?
All right.
There we go. Welcome
yeah,
back.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I have multiple networks here, and they're all flaky. So we do need better broadband in Connecticut. But back to the matter at hand.
Senator Anwar's proposal,
Yes.
and about to go into that analysis in the white paper that you have.
There are a couple issues. So Senator Anwar's proposal and DeSegregateCT are found in a couple of practices that have not necessarily been empirically borne out, which is that Connecticut is unusually segregated, and that segregation is caused by our local zoning, and that addressing our zoning will desegregate the state. And all of these things should be subject to closer scrutiny. Obviously, segregation is a situation we do not want. Our analysis at WestCog shows that Connecticut is comparably segregated to other states in the Northeast. In fact, Fairfield County is less segregated than the New York City metro as a whole. I'm not rendering an opinion whether it's too segregated, just to say we are in company with our peers. Second, to the extent that we are unusually segregated, and that is influenced by local land use control, keep in mind that most of the Northeast has local zoning. And so if the patterns we observe are the result of local zoning, then it's thousands of jurisdictions operating in concert. I find that slightly hard to believe. I suspect that given the scale of the problem, there are probably other factors at play, larger macroeconomic forces and federal policy we probably need to address if we want to address the issues and fix the issues that are out there. That said, that does not mean we can't do something at the local level. 830G has not built as many units as we've hoped. On the other hand, Connecticut, up until COVID-19, we'll see how this bears out. Connecticut was the slowest growing real estate market in the country outside of Fairfield County. It was the cheapest high income real estate market in the country. We were cheaper than Las Vegas, cheaper than Phoenix, cheaper than Houston, cheaper than Philadelphia. So there is for buying a house. For renting a house, however, that's a different matter. And one of the problems we see is perhaps there has not been enough multifamily construction in the state, and that's why we see higher rental rates. So we have to keep in mind that rental and purchase are different markets to some extent. If you look at Connecticut, most of the state has been very sluggish at building multifamily housing. The only bright spot has been Western Connecticut. We have 16% of the population, and we built 30% of the multifamily housing the last 10 years. So if Hartford is looking for models or paragons, they should look to Southwestern Connecticut because we are doing something right here. With regards to Anwar's bill, it makes a lot of proposals about local zoning. Basically what it does is takes away a lot of power and it vests the state with it. The state said, you shall do this. But it does not create a state planning and zoning commission. So it essentially makes local planning and zoning commissions minions of the state. Is that a good thing or not? I don't know. I'm agnostic about that. But it's really a fundamental revisiting of the division of powers in our system. And it's not clear that such a massive change, it's been called the most extreme change in zoning in 100 years, needs to occur to address what we see before us, which is the segregation that does exist, inequities and disparities that do exist. WestCog is advancing a number of modest proposals based on existing law and the current system that we think may actually do more in the long run because of general opposition and build off the framework we already have. But we are also concerned that that Anwar's proposal doesn't really address some of the elephants in the room. As we've all seen the protests of last year and Black Lives Matter the last 5 years, there are some real challenges this country faces. And I'm not going to make light of that. And one of the biggest ones is the racial wealth gap. And there's also a wealth gap between underprivileged white people and more privileged white people, but there's a huge racial wealth gap. 830G has done nothing to address that. In fact, 830G compounds the problem because if you buy an 830G unit, the appreciation in your home value is capped at the growth in median wages. And as we know, for the last 30 years, median wages have stagnated while home values, open market home values, have grown faster than that. So actually 830G could be argued to compound the problem, contribute to the systemic disparity. Another issue we don't see being addressed is the impact of property taxes. All of you know what a big chunk of change property taxes is. You see it in your mortgage payments, or if you are lucky enough to be paid off, you see it every half year, quarter, or year. And unlike mortgage payments, you don't build equity. You don't get your property taxes back. And the crushing property taxes from municipalities really prevents an accumulation, a building of home equity and household wealth. It depresses home values, and it keeps poor families from building the savings they need to invest in their future. It's really, we've known this for decades. We have not yet addressed it. And WestCog looked at this particularly on an intra-municipal level. And what we found is that property value appraisals, municipal appraisals or assessments within many municipalities are even biased against the poor and shift the burden even farther onto the poor. And this is a silent tax none of us see. We think it's a huge social justice issue. We've raised it, but it's not getting any traction right now because it doesn't neatly fit into an affordable housing agenda. So we are monitoring the situation. We are in conversation with DeSegregateCT. They are doing some tremendous work, as are many others. And we look forward to seeing this move in a direction that protects us from future costs, that protects the environment, the economy, that promotes jobs, and ultimately leads to more opportunity for all of Connecticut's residents.
Thank you, Francis. And would it be fair to say that in representing your members of WestCog, in your many conversations with them, they do understand and support the idea of increasing access and diversity and affordable housing throughout their entire community. But it is balanced by some of the analysis that you're providing to be able to have some real sustainable solutions. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely, Tony. And let me just take a side note here. We understand that opportunity is not equally distributed across the state. Jobs are not everywhere. Public water is not everywhere. If we want to have households succeed, there are a couple things we can do. We can put them close to jobs. We can put them by transit because owning a car is about $11,000 a year, which is a huge burden for a lower or moderate income household, especially if you have to have 2 cars. And we can connect them to public water and sewer infrastructure. That could be $25,000 to $50,000 per home. When you add all this up, you're talking about saving hundreds of thousands of dollars for those households over a 20 or 30-year period. So affordable housing, yes, we should have it everywhere in the state, but not homogeneously distributed. We need to put the affordable housing where the opportunity is.
And I think it's important to note from my past experience that historically there are communities that had exclusionary practices, covenants that have been put in there. It is important to not whitewash it over. Those did exist, but I can offer to you and get that reiteration from the many members that I've talked to within WestCog and throughout the state, that those kind of standards would never be allowed to stand. The law would not allow it, the community and the leadership would not allow it, but it did exist in the past. It is important to acknowledge it, but also it's important to acknowledge right now that those issues are protected by statute and that our local municipalities and all the general census of the community would never allow those kind of actions to exist.
Absolutely. That's a unanimous feeling in the region, Tony. We do not support any of those things, and we want households, families, people to succeed, regardless of who they are or where they are.
Thank you. And I will go to Matt Mandel. Matt, in his day job, is the executive director of the Westport Weston Chamber of Commerce, but he is also a passionate advocate in regards to land use and environmental protection. I know he's worked very closely with myself and fellow Senator Will Haskell. And welcome, Matt. Thank you for being here and offer your perspective from the town of Westport, which I know Jonathan and I both are very proud to represent.
Well, thank you for putting this together. I think it's exceedingly important to be discussing this issue. There clearly is a problem in our state with inequity of housing, with inequity of education. And it needs to be addressed. And I think that taking the time and effort to look at it and getting all the parties that you're putting together is the right way to go about it. From the Westport perspective, Westport has been trying to do affordable housing for many years, to the point that we had affordable housing before most other towns in our area, before 1990 when 830G was originally put in. Some of that affordable housing doesn't get credited to us in terms of the moratorium points, but regardless of that, is Westport, with all the things that we've done, still seems to be the whipping child of people who are saying, here is the problem with the small towns. Here is an example of why it's not getting done. It's not the case, though. We've created inclusionary zoning about 10, 11, 12 years ago in my capacity as I'm also on the RTM and chair of the planning and zoning committee of that. We were instrumental in creating inclusionary zoning, which affords a 20% affordable housing whenever you do any kind of multifamily housing. That's the kind of stuff that we're doing. Yet, when we look at the AMWR bill in 8-2, it is cast aside for a one-size-fits-all, as Ms. Guerra said, and it's laid to blame at the feet of the towns. And the solution is laid at the feet of the solution of the towns. And what that becomes is essentially blaming them and creating a collective punishment for everybody who lives there, and taking tens of thousands of families who are innocent. They didn't know that the prior zoning didn't allow people in, the restricted covenants. They're living there enjoying their lives, and they're really only guilty of wanting to live the American dream, that they want to live in their homes and enjoy it. It's a choice that they're making. And at the same time, Westport recognizes the issue, and to the point where we've approved 830G applications. We've denied some, absolutely, because some are inappropriate, but we've also approved some to the point that Westport has received a moratorium, which is sort of a crown jewel that the town holds high and says, here, we've done our work, we're trying to do that, yet we have this bill which is exceedingly aggressive. It talks about as of right multifamily housing, as of right ancillary dwelling units, without looking at what each town is doing. And when you take a town such as Westport that is actively trying to do things, and then you have this zoning, it makes everybody cower. And the invective and the innuendo that's used in saying you are bad actors, people are scared to explain and come forward and say, hey, look, we are trying. We recognize there's a problem, and we're trying to address it. Now, the other issue that I see with this is that the legislation basically say if we take it years in advance, and it does occur, it's how many people will be served by this, how much desegregation will occur. And what it's actually doing is saying flight from the inner cities, come to these places and not fix the major problem where we have educational inequity in the inner cities that must be addressed. And we all should be working together to find the funds, find the ideas, find the way to make economic zones, new communities. Instead of building on what's green, we should be building on what's gray. We should be taking the land that's already been developed and things that have gone wrong and warehouses that are bad and acres of land that could be redeveloped and spend our time and energy and money and put it that way. We shouldn't be taking what's working here and bringing it down. We should be taking what's down here and bringing it up and giving everybody the same opportunity. And that's where we need to be going. So ultimately, from my perspective, the one size fits all doesn't work. We need to all work together to come up with a way to educate people, to find affordable housing for people, to find ways to get rid of racial inequity, and not what we have in front of us, which is so draconian as to make people completely shake and get freaked out. We don't need that in our society. We need to work together to find a better solution.
Can you share some of your experiences from Westport and in your role as economic development to be able to shed some light on that?
Economic development and what we're doing. I mean, we're sitting in a place where developers see 830G and use it as a bludgeon to get what they want, rather than always come in and work with the community to do it. Westport's very willing to take 830G and talk to people and say, okay, instead of having 70 units with 21 of them being affordable, how about 40 over here and build it more in scale? And then we have it. We could build more of those rather than taking the time and fighting over something that's too immense. And I have to say, I've been fighting one particular one that instead of coming to the negotiating table, they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger because they keep spending more money fighting us. It's 16 years, but it's such an inappropriate place. Instead of, they're actually destroying an affordable area to build what they're calling as affordable housing. But what they're looking for is the market rate units that are actually more conducive for them to do it.
And that's an interesting point. And we've worked together with Representative Steinberg on this said project. Given the proposal that was mentioned earlier by Ken, if Senator Anwar's proposal or HB 5132 were to pass, the legal costs that would be borne by the municipalities when litigation occurs, would that have a significant chilling effect in the example that you just articulated with the project that we're talking about? Would that have a chilling effect in the opposition and the potential cost?
Well, it depends on which way you're talking about opposition. I mean, you've got the local opposition that has to raise their own money for each and every one of these. And that's a significant cost that the neighborhoods are willing to bear. Often they try to find grants to protect them if they can find them, or benefactors to help them out who are minded of the, have the same mind to go and do this. But if, let's say, Westport would have to pay for the legal fees for the lawyers against the town, then that would make it, people would question it. Now, Westport does have deeper pockets than some other towns. So maybe Westport's not the best example, where we might be willing to throw $250,000 against the development that we think would be problematic. And why do we think it's problematic? Well, because it's going to strain the infrastructure of the roads. It's going to strain the infrastructure of police and fire as you do that. And then if you bring in so many people, they're going to have kids, and that's going to strain the infrastructure of the schools. And that makes the whole area that much more dense. That's why we're a town and not a city. And the idea of making all towns cities sort of changes the dynamic of where people want to live and how we do it. We're talking about the diversity of housing. Well, that's exactly right. There's supposed to be diversity of housing and where people can live and find different ways. There needs to be a reason for people to work hard and get educated. And that goes back to the idea of we can't help out the people at risk unless we can educate them so that they can succeed as well. If we leave them behind, then we have an ever-ending cycle of the same thing. And instead, we bring down this, and then everybody's in the same mess. And what Francis was talking about, that 40% of the money comes from Fairfield County that goes up to Hartford. Well, if you have people who begin to not work properly and it doesn't work and the infrastructure's becoming problematic and taxes are going up, then you may have flight from there. Now the money that should be going to the state to help the people at risk is gone. So we need to figure out how all of us to work together, taxes, ideas, to make sure things work better.
Well, thank you, Matt, and I appreciate the panelists. Now, we're going to go to questions that have been shared through email, but before we go to that, let me go back to the order in which my state delegation members have presented earlier to ask if you have any questions for the various panelists. We'll start with Representative Devlin.
Thank you. I don't have a specific question related to what you've shared, and I'm so impressed with the information that has been discussed here. But what has struck me, and Francis, I think it was in your presentation particularly, was that identifying what some of these premises are that all of this activity is founded upon. And at the same time, and he may have changed his mind at this point, but it wasn't too long ago that the governor came out and said his solution for economic development is to double the population in our urban cities. So it's just an interesting sort of mix and almost conflict of what are we really trying to achieve and what's the best way to do it. And I think, again, if we don't have an economy that supports job creators, we can create all the kinds of housing. I mean, the apartments that I see going up in the communities of Fairfield and Trumbull are remarkable. I don't know where all these people are going to come from, because there certainly is a lot of flight from the, congested urban New York City that also really wants to have the sort of country landscape. So it's you've raised probably more questions for me, nothing specific that I can sort of throw at you, but it is definitely a complex issue.
Thank you. Representative Devlin? Representative Farnan, please?
Could Francis just respond real quick?
Sure. Francis?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think you make a really good point, or you suggest one, which is Saad Anwar's bill and DeSegregateCT until now have not had an urban focus. Are they anti-urban? I don't know. But if we rewind maybe a year or 9 months before COVID-19, the story was that Connecticut was losing population. We had not created net new jobs since 1989, which is critical to helping people out of poverty and building household wealth. We should not forget that, not just housing, but one of the kind of sob stories about Connecticut was that we don't have vibrant large cities that attract millennials and young people and empty nesters and creative classes, and also provide career ladders for lower and moderate skilled people. And there's nothing in any of these proposals that addresses fixing our cities. And the real estate people still say the long-term trajectory for Connecticut, COVID-19 is a blip. It's stagnation and slight population loss. If we are going to build new housing units in outlying areas, where are those people going to come from? Are they going to be siphoned out of the cities? If so, they'll probably be the most upperly mobile people in the cities. What happens to those people who are left behind? One of the principal reasons some of our central cities have not fared so well is that they have been bled of people, bled of jobs, bled of capital, bled of investment in housing. And all this does, as far as I can see, is continue that trend. So an excellent question.
Thank you. Thank you, Francis. I got ahead of myself. Representative Farnan?
Thank you so much. So, I mean, I would like to see things like senior housing not being as discounted when it comes to 830G calculations. Also, things we want to do the 10% requirement. But the reality is, especially with a lot of our urban legislators, they see any watering down of that law as a step back. So what do you think is the best way to build some level of trust and faith that what we're trying to do here by making some of these alterations in the law, which will make it easier for some towns to step outside of the requirements of 830G, what do you think are the best ways to say to them, we listen, we want affordable housing, let's work together? What are some of the ideas that you would throw out that I think that would get them to come to the table to say, okay, let's talk, let's find a better law?
Can I direct that to Betsy?
Sure, thank you for the question. Well, one of the things we're looking at with 830G, in addition to the 10% threshold, is really how they count affordable housing. And they don't include anything that was built prior to, I believe it's 1990, when the Affordable Housing Appeals Act was adopted. They also don't include anything unless it's deed restricted. And so that really narrows the focus of what is affordable housing. And it is interesting. I was talking to a woman that lived in affordable housing in Old Saybrook. And I said, well, that's great. You know, I'm glad that you've been able to take advantage of it. She said her rent was over $1,600 a month. And because my family's in real estate, my husband's family for generations, I know that in Durham, we have single family homes that are available to rent for much less than $1,600 a month. And so, you know, I think we need to start talking more about that and try to really figure out what is truly our affordable housing needs in our community. And maybe we should capture those others to figure out kind of what what we're looking at here. The other issue, in talking to the State Department of Housing, Mike Santoro was on a recent webinar with Cost, talking about the fact that, if towns do a better job of planning smaller scale affordable housing that actually meets the needs in their community, then they kind of have a way to push back against those 830G proposals, because the state can see that you're doing something, and it's not going to protect you completely, but it does show that you're willing to accommodate these issues, that you're willing to move the dial on affordable housing in a way that makes sense for your community. A lot of towns now are looking at mixed use buildings where you have small retail shops and then apartments and complexes of that nature as a way to do this, to build up their downtowns, as well as to provide some more affordable housing options for their communities. There's a lot of towns looking at the accessory apartments issue. I mean, the problem that we have with the proposal under consideration is that, again, it's very prescriptive. Even if your town already allows accessory apartments, you have to rewrite your zoning laws to make sure that they comply with the prescriptive requirements of the law. And that's with certain setback requirements, that they are approved if they're on a certain size lot, that they can be detached or attached. And there's no consideration whatsoever in the law or the proposal that I reviewed as to the septic system, and whether or not you have to comply with the public health code, which limits the available units based on the capacity of your septic system. So, again, I don't know that we can completely push back against 830G, but I think if we're more proactive as communities and addressing the affordable housing by using the tools that we have available, I think that will go a long way in that effort.
Thank you.
Senator, I just wanted to comment on that. Those are some terrific comments, and I absolutely agree with that. When we pursued the legislation starting in 15, that was essentially a process which we were able to pass in 17. Some things that we really looked at were incentive housing zones. So we messed around with the point totals with that, where we encouraged towns to use that more, where they were actually awarded more towards a moratorium on those programs. In terms of the senior housing, that's always something we've kind of had to push and pull against. We've always reached that full point, but unfortunately, the other side hasn't really been able to give on that. We were able to eventually reach a compromise in 2017 where a full point was awarded for senior leave if it was tied to that also had 60% family housing, which and this goes exactly to those definitions. Certain things are counted, certain things are not. But in terms of our overall success, and another reason why the legislation we passed in is getting ready to sunset at the end of 2022. So if it's you want to pursue as a potential permanent solution, or even, maybe make the language better, then it's really something that we should start pushing this session.
Thank you. And we do have some questions from the general public, but I wanted to have Representative McCarthy-Vahey, if you have any particular questions, and go to Representative Steinberg as well afterwards.
Thank you. Well, as Chair of Planning and Development, I'd like to actually just reframe a couple of things. I think so much of this conversation is about opportunity. And it is a really tough conversation, which is why I think it's really important that we're careful about how we have it. I think to Matt, to your point, sometimes people feel backed in corners. And I think on both sides of this issue that happens, which is why this year in the Planning and Development Committee, I'm really looking forward to hearing from all different perspectives, whether it's about building on the strengths in the communities we have or providing opportunity in cities and in towns. I think it's really important. And I think when we talk about this issue, there certainly are issues around segregation, the racial wealth gap that Francis talked about, which is very real. There's also the issue of economic development. And I think sometimes when we talk about multifamily housing or density in housing, we conflate the issues around affordability versus what the market is willing to bear and what kind of demand we've had for housing in terms of the diverse housing stock. And where you have seniors who want to downsize, or if you have young people wanting to move in and kind of start out. I think those things are really important. I also just want to emphasize what Betsy said is so, so true. 5132, and I think there's been a lot of misinformation out there about that. Number one, does not get rid of the ability for towns and cities to regulate and zone for historic character. It absolutely doesn't. It does take the word character out, but it's still in the later section. You can see the language in the bill, and I would refer people there. But I do think it's important to understand that 5132 in part was to give communities those tools. And I am so excited about the Affordable Housing Toolkit. I've been able to be a part of the advisory group with the Department of Housing. That is so true, Betsy. Couldn't agree with you more in that we need to be able to give the communities the tools they need and encourage, providing carrots as opposed to sticks. And I can't remember who said that, means that we've got to invest. That means we have to put dollars in, whether as a state, certainly the federal government, or municipalities. We've got to provide some funding, more funding than we have. Otherwise, it's, too much gets left to the market, and that's where some of the struggles have come in for folks with 830G. I'm really interested in a conversation this year that will allow us to really have some of these frank conversations in solutions-focused ways that really kind of dig into the issues, because home that's where we live. It's where we are. It's so central to everybody's everyday lives. And we really want to offer opportunity and choices for people. So thanks for this conversation. I look forward to a lot more of them.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Representative Steinberg.
I'll just reiterate some points that Representative McCarthy-Vahey made. I think we have to be careful when we talk about flight, whether it's urban flight or suburban flight, because that only emphasizes the divisions. And we have to ask ourselves the question, why is it this continues to be an issue even with 830G? I think part of the argument is, despite the best of intentions, 830G has not achieved all of its intended goals. But I also think it reflects a systemic division between urban and suburban rural that is not necessarily the case in some other states, where there's been a more organic, one could almost call it symbiotic relationship between urban areas and the surrounding suburbs, which have led to the kind of cooperation that we talk about in Connecticut, but we have not really accomplished. I confess, if 830G is a dirty word to some folks, I don't know if it's even a word. Another one would be regionalism. Now, as a former chair of the Moore Commission, I kind of like the idea of regionalism, even if the word itself has attained pejorative connotations. If people remember the Moore Commission, the MO in Moore stands for municipal opportunities. And it really was intended to emphasize municipalities working collaboratively to find solutions along those lines. What we see here today with Desegregate Connecticut and Senator Anwar's bill is the frustration born of the fact that's still not happening. There were still 169 towns operating independently, and there isn't enough sense of shared interest and shared vision, which allows our cities, which are struggling and need help, to work with their surrounding suburbs to solve a variety of problems, of which housing is essential, but not only one. Transportation, to me, is a huge issue as well as all the other economic factors. So what I want to really emphasize is that we should take the suggestions by Senator Anwar, by Desegregate Connecticut, in the spirit in which they're offered. These are, in some ways, pleas for assistance, pleas for cooperation that have fallen short to this point in the game. And even though this may not be the solution that is going to please everyone, I agree with Representative McCarthy-Vahey. We've got to have this dialogue going. We've got to find ways, when we used to have a program called Home Connecticut, it was all about incentives, but we didn't put any money into it. There may be several ways in which we can accomplish these ends, but I really want to do is foster relationships between municipalities of different sizes and shapes and find ways to solve a bunch of these problems. Maybe we bring back the Moore Commission. That's me.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Steinberg. And I do have some questions for the panelists, and one of them was, I think, raised by Betsy in regards to the continual pull and tug between individual land rights, property owner land rights, an individual that moves into a 1 acre, 2 acre zone based upon the premise of that location and their property value and rights. Do they not have any impact? I think that was the question that was phrased, is the fact that where does a line get drawn in regards to the state telling individuals their property rights and their ability, gets superseded by the dictate of the state?
I'd like to respond to that, Senator. Yeah, I was very concerned when I read Senator Anwar's proposal, and if I read it correctly, that the as of right provisions would actually streamline the approval process. Okay, I can get that. Local approval processes can be a bit clunky, but it also eliminated the opportunity for the public to hold a hearing or to participate in a hearing to weigh in on that. And as a property owner, I think we all have to be very worried about that our voice would be lost in terms of that, because you are impacted by what your neighbors are doing in terms of their building lot, and if something is encroaching on your property right, I think you should retain the right to be able to voice those concerns at a public hearing on the local level.
Thank you. I know we have scheduled it to 5:15. If the panelist is willing to extend that, I have an array of questions that I want to be able to try to address. This came from a...
Could I extend?
Matt,
could I
go ahead.
extend
I'm
on
sorry.
what Ms. Garrison?
Matt, please.
The other aspect is not just the public won't be able to speak, but in some cases, outside bodies within the town won't be recognized for what they have to say, such as if conservation says there's an environmental issue, if fire says that there's a fire issue, if police say there's a safety issue. Part of the legislation removes those bodies from being entertained by planning and zoning as part of their decision. So it really, what you're saying, it's not just streamlining, it's gutting essentially the process that we have for public hearings to everything to be weighed properly to decide whether something is good or bad for a community.
Thank you, Matt. I just wanted to get to a number of questions that have been raised. This comes from Frank Patisi, who is the RTM member and Vice Chair of Public Works and Planning in Fairfield, along with the similar question in regards to what considerations are given to environmental impacts under the current proposed land use zoning legislation. Are there any being prioritized? For example, wetlands, conservation areas, impervious cover, low impact development designs for developments. Any perspectives in regards to environmental impact? Francis or Betsy or Ken or Matt?
Proposals I've seen, there is absolutely no consideration of the environmental impact, and that's very troubling. There's also no consideration, as I mentioned earlier, about the public health code. That's a big concern. And one of the provisions in Senator Anwar's bill, it hasn't gotten discussed a lot, is that it would actually limit the opportunity to file amicus briefs in 830G litigation, which I know the environmentalists, and I did reach out to the Connecticut Fund for the Environment and other groups, were very concerned about, because they have used that to weigh in and try to argue that certain developments, high density developments, should not be located on environmentally sensitive lands. And so I think that that was something that in that bill, that was a big red flag to us.
Yes, and additionally, in terms of the potential 830G changes that have been proposed, it looks to add to the types of commission decisions that are appealable as water pollution and flood control, where in the past those were not appealable. This would potentially add those in.
Right, and then the
Thank
other,
you.
another.
Francis or Matt? Great, thank you. Another question that may be directed to Ken is, given the current statute of 8-30G and 8-2, with the current proposals that may be underway, what are the exceptions in which challengers and neighborhoods could utilize that is still currently in statute, what kind of issues could they raise as points of question for community groups and towns that is protected or under consideration available under the current statute?
Well, it goes back to that health safety recognition of the need for the affordable housing has to outweigh the issue of health and safety. And I want to really emphasize that outweigh part, because a case, an attorney can still prove that, there's concerns, there's public health concerns, there's safety concerns over this site, but the judge still has to take into account, does the need for affordable housing outweigh those concerns? And as we've seen often in cases, those needs outweigh those concerns. So when you're talking about making this statute even, less town friendly, I would argue, when now you're talking about having towns having to possibly cover legal fees, you're really, making it much more difficult for towns to even challenge it when it was already an extremely difficult challenge to begin with.
The other additional question comes from the president of the Susquehannock Association, which is a open space as well as a village improvement association in Southport, Connecticut. The town of Fairfield has already a strong incentive to build affordable housing. Without attaining the required 10% or even the moratorium percentage, the town is largely powerless to prevent high-density housing in areas without sufficient infrastructure, such as roads, sidewalks, and schools. Is not the current 830G legislation a sufficient incentive without further weakening the town's autonomy in 8-2?
Well, as we've seen, through this process, and actually my hometown just went through something similar in Newington, where it was actually a government-funded project. It was a project that was funded under the 9% low-income housing tax credit program, which, the issues that go along with that. But it was a situation where the town essentially tried to argue, the traffic, it's going to be in a bad place, it's not going to be safe, where we've really seen over these years that it's extremely tough for towns to argue. We've seen housing be built in questionable areas simply because 830G, when these developers go to towns and say, oh, I want to build this project, and towns simply say, oh, well, work with us on it. We'll figure something out that fits the area. And the developer essentially says, well, I'll just add on 2 floors of affordable housing and you'll have to take it as is. I think, unfortunately, it's kind of widened the gap, and we're just seeing it more and more at this time.
Thank you. I want to finish up by asking,
if I may, just to say very specific, the proposal in 8-2, I think, has really been misconstrued. The use of the word character, which is not something that's measurable. That was a bill that was worked on with the Connecticut Bar Association land use section. And one of the suggestions and reason for removing that was that it was not something measurable, so that our volunteer planning and zoning commissioners and our courts had a more difficult time defining that. I often use, setbacks, density, all those things are still included in 8-2. That was one of the reasons that was because the term was so subjective. And as a social worker, I often say when you bring in a child to, they say they're not feeling well, and you ask for certain measurable things like, has the appetite changed? Are they sleeping more? Have the grades gone down? We want to make sure that we still are able to regulate in that 8-2 zoning enabling framework, which is, like Ken said earlier, gives the towns the ability to regulate. So I just want to be clear and emphasize that that was a proposed change. The bill didn't pass, but it would not take away a community's ability to regulate historic preservation in particular. I want to make sure everybody's clear about that.
thank you. And why don't we go back to the same order? And the question I'd like to ask at closing out is, I'm sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Just quickly about the word character. It's an interesting concept to remove it, because saying that it is, it's undefinable. Yet the body that's making the decision knows what the character of one's town is. and what it is. Now, as long as character isn't used to ensure that we remain segregated, that's where the bugaboo is. No one should be saying character in terms of keeping particular people out. The character should be defining what it looks like, what it feels like, but not in relationship to people. The question then is, if character doesn't work, is the next word essence? Is the next word spirit? Or maybe we get rid of French and say the je ne sais quoi. At what point do we figure out how do we do this when we start parsing words and how we do it? The idea of character is, it's single family, or it's low density. It's no larger than 20 feet to the midpoint of a roof. That's the character of a community. So when you start pulling words out that are being used, then people will just start using other words to define the same thing. So I'm not sure it's an effective way of accomplishing what they want to do.
Thank you, Matt. That is actually a great point, because the challenge we have is, for historical districts, we have examples and single family, to then put in right in the middle of that neighborhood. A high density housing is inconsistent with the character of the community, and to remove that is I believe one that raises serious concerns and questions. But let me go to, as we close, in having each of the panelists, because it is all about finding solutions. So perhaps I could ask, in the order that you all presented, if you had one solution that you would like to offer and be heard in regards to creating more access, more diversity, and more opportunities for everyone in every community. What would you offer to say, Ken? And we'll go to Betsy afterwards. Just one quick solution.
Yeah, I'm going to give you one, and I'll give you a bonus one. My original solution would be accessory apartments. They would really, we would need to work to group, I think, everyone, all the advocates, on what would be an acceptable language and time frame. Especially with, the seniors we have in state. We have many college students who, come back, move back home with the parents for a little bit after school. So I think that's something we should look into, and I think it's can be done both user and town friendly if we approach it right. My bonus suggestion would be to really start using the incentive housing zones again. Yes, funding needs to go into that, but if we're serious about propping up our affordable housing, and nobody on this call is against the idea of creating more affordable housing, then we need to make sure our money backs up our words.
Thank you, Ken. Betsy?
Incentivize. I think that's the way that we need to go, and I think that this dialogue has been important to moving the dial on those issues, and I think we need to build on the efforts that we currently have in place and adequately funding them to properly incentivize the promotion of affordable housing in our communities.
Thank you. And Francis, before you go, I wanted to make sure that the white paper that you cited and the research and the data points, if you could share that with myself, I'll make sure to put that onto our website and make that readily available to people that has an interest in reading that data point. And thank you for joining us. But I know WestCog has come up with many proposals and considerations. Can you offer us one?
Okay, well, I'll give you one and also a bonus. One of them is use a modern, consistent definition of family statewide that includes all families, even non-family households. We need to end discrimination on that front. The bonus is develop a market-based mechanism that puts locational choice in the hands of prospective renters and home buyers instead of confining them to a small smattering of 830G deed-restricted units.
Thank you, Francis. And Matt?
I think it's twofold. I think Ms. Guerra has the point, incentivizing, using inclusionary housing zones where the town knows where it wants to put it, make sure it goes there and say, listen, you have to build 20% affordable if you want a multifamily housing, and it's to a certain scale, but it starts to bring people in within the realm of the community. The other thing that needs to be done, we must need to invest in the education of our children at risk. And that goes without saying. And we can't have it squandered. We can't have it going to other places. We need to educate, because if we educate all of our children, next generation will be smarter, better, and Connecticut will be stronger.
Thank you. And again, I want to thank you all for joining us and offering your perspective and insight, and to the audience that have been listening in. It really is about transparency, accountability, and having these dialogues with all the major shareholders. We've been able to vet a lot of the conversation. It is not exclusive. I hope this is, as I said before, the beginning of the dialogue where many viewpoints and all shareholders will have an opportunity to articulate their perspective. And many of our constituents that are encountering some of the challenges and are very emotionally as well as theoretically concerned with high density housing, we want to be sure that we afford them a voice, and their concerns need to be addressed. I have always believed that government should represent the view of the people and not a top-down, heavy, one-sided perspective. I think the other exciting part that I'm happy to announce is the fact that I'm eager to be an integral part of that, because thankfully for my Senate leadership, that I was just named as the ranking leader of Planning and Development Committee. And I'm very excited to work with Representative McCarthy-Vahey as the chair and be able to continue more of these dialogues, greater transparency, greater dialogue, and try to find solutions. Because the bottom line is, I believe every one of our communities, every individual has an opportunity, deserves an opportunity to get access to safe, affordable, and access to housing. So again, thank you for all that are participating. I'm very excited that this will be an ongoing dialogue. And for those that are listening in, if you have any viewpoints and particulars, you can contact me and also will provide all the necessary information that was mentioned by Mr. Pickering or Ms. Guerra, and we will continue the dialogue. But again, thank you all for joining us. The conversation has begun, and I think the focus has to be, we need to find solutions with all shareholders' input. So thank you all very, very much. Have a great holiday. Be happy and safe, and be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you.